Hey everybody, this week we're taking a closer look at Chapter 5 of our textbook, Playthings of the Mind, John Locke and Children's Literature, and really thinking about his influence on the development of the genre. While the time period that we're looking at this week has some overlap with that of the Puritans, we're really starting to see the emergence of some trends that move us closer to the development of modern children's literature as we know it. And that has a lot to do with the understanding of books as objects meant to bring delight. So let's get started. First of all, who is John Locke and why do we have a whole unit centered around one guy? He's not an author or a publisher of children's literature, but John Locke is generally agreed to have had a lot of formative influence on the development of Western traditions in children's literature. He was actually an English philosopher writing in the late 1600s, and Locke held forth on a lot of subjects like politics and religion, but particularly relevant to our purposes here, he wrote about the education of children. His most influential piece when it comes to this subject was probably an essay from 1692 titled Some Thoughts Concerning Education. This piece was important because it really contributed to the Enlightenment era understanding of methods of teaching, and eventually it really affected an overall reform in the broad approach to children's literature. If there's one Hall of Fame idea that stands out from this text, it's probably the concept of tabula rasa, or the blank slate. And this was a new way of envisioning the minds of children. Tabula rasa puts forth that children aren't born with innate ideas already stocked in their brain. They're not predisposed to any particular nature, neither to be good or wicked. They simply learn from experience. A kind of fun example, Locke really believed in this concept to the point that he said, children aren't naturally afraid of the dark. They learn that fear from the stories of their nannies. Which really highlights this idea that kids are just kind of empty vessels waiting to be filled up, so they absorb and take in a lot from their environment. Ultimately, that makes the child a product of his or her education and experiences, which sort of highlights how crucial the quality of that education is. This marks the beginning of a trend in childhood education where kids are learning from experience and interaction with their environment rather than just for rote memorization. The second major tentpole, you might say, of Locke's philosophy when it comes to childhood education is the idea of instruction merged with delight. John Locke really strongly advocated for this idea that enjoyment didn't distract from a lesson, it actually enhanced its effectiveness. So playthings become essential to the learning process. Lehrer actually uses a crazy term for it on page 106, a recreational epistemology. Essentially, this means that toys become teachable objects, which eventually spawns a whole new tradition in children's literature, this idea of books meant to inspire learning through play. And one publisher who really took that to heart was John Newbery. We're going to be reading an excerpt this week from A Little Pretty Pocketbook, which was one of John Newbery's most popular texts, published in 1744. And it really embodies the influence of John Locke's philosophy. You can see his fingerprints all over this thing. When parents bought this book, it was accompanied with small toys. It says right here on the title page, with 2 letters from Jack the Giant Killer, as also a ball and pin cushion. And these were meant to be learning objects. Other books might have pictures to cut out and paste, and a variety of companion toys that were meant to sort of form these everyday tools of learning. We see further down the title page here that this was all chalked up as part of a new attempt to teach children the use of the English alphabet by way of diversion or fun. So while these are still didactic pieces of literature meant to give instruction, it's a far cry from the sober narratives of the Puritans. So, when we look back at the influence of John Locke's legacy on children's literature, Lehrer argues that there are a number of qualities that we might see kind of indicative of a Lockean narrative. Certainly, this emphasis on the book itself as an object of delight. Interestingly enough, we also see the emergence of new perspectives and types of characters in children's literature. So, for example, animals that talk and feel that are represented as unique characters. Locke argued that children should really be taught to think about non human sensibility or taking care of other creatures. So, this led to a greater consideration of animals in literature. And Lair has a list for us of, some of these funny titles that kind of are spawning out of this period. The Life and Adventures of a Lapdog, The Life and Perambulation of a Mouse. Which sounds a little old fashioned, but I think we can really see the lasting legacy of that trend in much more contemporary titles as well. Lehrer argues on page 110, for example, that Winnie the Pooh is one of those stories that kind of embodies some of the Lockean tradition. And not just animals, but inanimate objects were part of this new group, kind of imbued with sensibility. Part of this legacy is of toys that come alive. We hear later in the chapter about stories such as Adventures of a Banknote, but I think that there's also somewhat of a direct lineage if you jump forward in time to something like the Velveteen Rabbit. There are experiments in perspective carried out through the literature. Lear asks the question on page 123, what would it mean to see the world as if one were a worm, a pincushion, or a pet? These are considered now relevant questions, right, for children's literature to grapple with. Sort of fantastical considerations that are much closer to what we're used to from modern children's books. So that's all I've got for now. I'm so looking forward to hearing what you think about the work of Locke and Newbery this week.